The airstrip was supposed to be quiet that morning, but the sudden scream of an engine shattered the calm like a warning siren. Every mechanic on the ground turned toward the sky as a lone Allied aircraft staggered toward the runway. Its wings were trembling, smoke poured from its left engine, and a trail of oil streaked across the sky behind it. No one could understand how the plane was still in the air. It had just returned from a mission that most crews whispered about with fear. A mission that meant facing the enemy's most terrifying new weapon. Pilots called it a death dealer. No aircraft caught in its sights was expected to come home in one piece. The wheels slammed against the runway, bouncing once before gripping the ground. The plane skidded sideways, metal shrieking as it fought to stay upright. When it finally crawled to a stop, the ground crew rushed forward, expecting to find a cockpit full of casualties and a fuselage barely holding together. Officers exchanged looks that said the same thing. This aircraft was finished, scrap metal, beyond saving. But among the rushing crowd stood the youngest mechanic on the base, barely 20, still wearing a uniform that looked too new for war. As everyone else shook their heads at the wreckage, he stepped closer and stared at the torn metal with a puzzled expression. Something about the pattern of damage made no sense. Something was wrong, or maybe something was hidden, and he was the only one who saw it. He did not know it yet, but this strange discovery was about to expose the one weakness in the enemy's most feared weapon, and it would change the war in a way no one could have imagined. By the middle years of the war, the skies over Europe had become some of the most dangerous places on Earth. Every mission pushed Allied pilots to their limits, and every return flight felt like a miracle. The aircraft themselves were battered daily. Engines overheated, rivets shook loose, wings tore open under stress, and no amount of preparation could keep up with the punishment these machines endured. Every hour, a plane either limped home covered in scars or never came back at all. The pressure on the air forces was relentless, and the burden fell not only on the pilots, but also on the ground crews who worked without sleep, food, or complaint. Mechanics became the invisible lifeline of the war effort. Veteran technicians could diagnose problems by sound alone, but there simply weren't enough of them. As losses grew and missions increased, airbases began rushing teenagers and barely trained recruits into roles that demanded the experience of seasoned engineers. These rookies learned through desperation. They made mistakes, worked through the night, and often carried guilt for every aircraft that failed to return. No one expected much from them. They were simply warm bodies filling empty boots. Among them was a young mechanic named Thomas Reed, 20 years old, with a face that still held the softness of someone who had grown up too quickly. Before the war, he had worked in his uncle's small garage, changing tires and fixing broken tractors. It was hardly the training needed to repair war machines that flew into enemy fire. Yet shortages and urgency pushed him straight onto the front lines, surrounded by men who had been working on aircraft for years. Most of them barely noticed him. To them, he was the kid who fetched tools, the one who listened more than he spoke. But Thomas had something others did not. He watched everything. He paid attention to details. He questioned things that others accepted as routine. So on the morning that the damaged aircraft staggered back to base, when everyone else expected a pile of wreckage, Thomas stepped forward. The noise, the smoke, and the chaos faded from his mind. All he saw was the strange, impossible pattern carved in the metal. And for the first time, he felt the war calling on him to do something more. The enemy weapon that haunted Allied pilots was not just another upgrade or improvement. It was something entirely new. Something designed with a kind of precision and brutality that felt almost unfair. Crews whispered about it in the mess halls, lowering their voices as if speaking too loudly would summon it out of the clouds. Official reports gave it a technical name, but no one used it. To the men who flew into the heart of battle, it was known simply as the Reaper. The Reaper was mounted on a fast, predatory fighter that the Axis had recently released. It carried a newly engineered cannon that fired at a velocity no previous weapon had reached. The shells punched through armor, fuel tanks, and the thickest parts of an aircraft's frame as if they were made of paper. What made it even more terrifying was the guidance system that worked with the cannon. Rumors spread that it used some form of early radar assistance, allowing the pilot to lock onto targets with eerie accuracy. Whether the rumors were true or not, one thing was certain. When the Reaper appeared in the sky, Allied crews braced for death. Survivors described the experience in the same way. First came the sudden glint of silver in the clouds, then the sound of heavy shells ripping through the air, a deep and unnatural crack that felt like the sky itself was tearing. A single burst from the cannon could amputate a wing, sever control lines, or ignite fuel tanks that usually stayed safe behind layers of plating. There were missions where the Reaper took down 3, 4, even 5 aircrafts in minutes, disappearing before escorts could react. Pilots learned to spot its silhouette instantly. A long nose, swept wings, and a posture in the air that seemed almost predatory. They prayed not to see it. Some even turned back early when they believed it was nearby. The mental toll was devastating. Confidence faded, morale crumbled, and the sense of helplessness grew because no Allied engineer had found a weakness in the weapon. Every attempt to reinforce aircraft armor failed. Every tactical adjustment only slowed the inevitable. It felt unbeatable, a storm no one could outrun. Until the morning Thomas Reed stepped toward that damaged aircraft and noticed the one detail everyone else had missed. A detail that would unravel the Reaper's power in the most unexpected way. The sound of the damaged aircraft rolling onto the airfield was unlike anything the base had heard in weeks. The engine coughed and sputtered as if every rotation might be its last. Smoke poured from the fuselage in thick waves, leaving a dark trail across the runway. Panels flopped loosely in the wind, and several sections of the wing were so shredded that daylight passed straight through them. The crew inside looked pale and shaken, their clothes soaked with sweat, their hands trembling as they climbed out of the cockpit. They had flown through a storm of cannon fire that should have blown them out of the sky. By every law of physics and probability, they should not have made it back. Officers gathered quickly, their expressions grim. One glance told them the aircraft was beyond saving. The belly was ripped open, the tail section was cracked, one landing gear hung barely attached. A few men muttered that the plane must have survived only because the pilots were too stubborn to die. Others guessed it had simply slipped through the Reaper's sights for a moment. No one imagined that this wreck held an answer the Allied forces had been searching for. The experienced mechanic scanned the damage out of habit, but none lingered long. There was no point in repairing something this far gone. The engineers had their clipboards ready, preparing to write it off as another casualty of the Reaper's unmatched firepower. Thomas Reed saw something different. While the others walked away, he stepped closer, drawn by a curious glint in the torn metal near the wing root. The pattern wasn't random. One section of the fuselage showed melted edges, but another right beside it had clean, almost polished curves, as if a projectile had bounced off at an impossible angle. The shrapnel path was misaligned, inconsistent with everything he had learned during his short training. It didn't match any known type of impact. That was the moment the truth began to reveal itself, and Thomas realized this wreck was not junk. It was a message waiting to be decoded. Thomas spent the next hour circling the wrecked aircraft, while the rest of the ground crew moved on to other tasks. He ran his fingers slowly along the torn aluminum, studying every strange curve and ripple. The more he looked, the more convinced he became that something unusual had happened in the air. It was not just luck that the plane survived. Something had interfered with the enemy's weapon. Something small and accidental, hidden within the chaos of battle damage. He could feel it in his chest, a certainty he could not yet explain. When he finally approached the senior mechanics, they were busy arguing about which replacement parts they needed for another aircraft. Thomas waited for a pause, then cleared his throat and said the words no one expected. He believed he had found a flaw in the Reaper's weapon. The men stared at him, then burst into tired, dismissive laughter. One of them asked him if he planned to solve the war with a wrench and a prayer. Another told him to get back to sorting tools. But Thomas did not back down. He explained what he saw, the odd pattern of melting and deflection, the way the shrapnel path curved instead of cutting straight through. He suggested that the surface of the aircraft might have created a kind of disruption, something that altered the cannon's impact. Then he proposed an idea, an improvised modification that sounded almost childish. He wanted to add a thin layer of mesh inside a reinforced patch, covered with a coat of thick paint that would slightly change the way the enemy rounds interacted with the metal. It was not standard. It was not approved. It was barely even tested. To the veterans, it sounded ridiculous. They laughed again, but the laughter did not last long. Manpower was short, time was short, and they needed every working aircraft they could get into the sky. One of the officers, overhearing the conversation, stepped in and asked a simple question. Would it damage the plane further if it failed? Thomas shook his head. The risk was minimal. So they gave him one aircraft, one chance, one opportunity to prove that his unlikely, unpolished, almost foolish idea could do something no engineer had achieved. Thomas gathered his materials with shaking hands, knowing that the next few hours might change everything. Thomas began his work long after most of the mechanics had called it a night. The hangar lights flickered weakly, casting long shadows across the concrete floor, and the cold crept in through the massive open doors. He stood beside the chosen aircraft, a mission-worn bomber with its nose scuffed and its wings patched from previous battles. To everyone else, it was just another machine waiting for its next assignment. To Thomas, it was a canvas for the idea that no one believed in but him. He laid out the materials he had gathered, a thin mesh screen he salvaged from a damaged ventilation panel, a small roll of high-strength tape, a sheet of scrap aluminum that he cut into uneven patches using an old pair of tin snips, thick industrial paint that usually coated the undersides of aircraft to protect them from corrosion. Nothing about the setup looked promising. In fact, it looked more like a school project than a military repair. The first challenge was shaping the mesh to fit precisely inside the panel he planned to reinforce. The metal resisted him, bending awkwardly or snapping in places, and he had to improvise by heating it gently with a maintenance torch just to soften it enough to mold. He burned his fingers more than once, but he kept working, jaw clenched, eyes focused. He used spare wiring to secure the mesh in place, weaving it through the frame like someone stitching fabric by hand. There was no instruction for this in any manual. There was no guarantee it would hold under stress. As the hours passed, a few mechanics wandered back into the hangar to retrieve forgotten tools. They noticed Thomas crouched beside the aircraft, painting over the patch with exaggerated care. Some shook their heads, others smirked. One muttered that the kid was wasting good materials. Thomas pretended not to hear any of it. He understood their doubt. After all, how could this awkward patch, made from scraps and tape and stubborn hope, stand against the most advanced weapon the enemy had ever unleashed? When the final layer of paint dried, he stepped back to examine his work. The modification looked embarrassingly simple, a slightly raised patch where the new material lay hidden beneath a smooth coat of dark paint. Anyone who did not know what they were looking for would assume it was just another repair, nothing more. Even Thomas felt a moment of uncertainty as he stared at it. He had no proper equations, no technical data, no expert validation, only a gut feeling and the memory of that strange damage pattern on the wrecked plane. By dawn, he was exhausted, covered in dust and paint, his eyes red from the strain. The officers inspected his work with guarded expressions, not quite convinced, not quite dismissive. The pilot assigned to test the aircraft eyed the patch with a deep frown, clearly wondering why he was risking his life for something that looked like it belonged in a workshop back home. But it was too late to turn back. The modification was done, and soon the skies would reveal whether Thomas had created a breakthrough or a disaster. Captain James Harrington, a seasoned pilot known for his calm under fire, stood beside the modified aircraft with the furrowed brow. He had seen countless machines fail under the Reaper's assault, and he had no faith in a patchwork repair dreamed up by a rookie. Yet orders were orders, and the young mechanic's insistence carried the weight of something unusual, something he could not yet define. With a resigned sigh, Harrington climbed into the cockpit, checking his instruments and strapping himself in as the hangar doors slowly opened to the morning sky. The engine roared to life, louder than usual, shaking the hangar floor as the propellers cut through the crisp air. Thomas watched from below, heart pounding. Every takeoff was a gamble, but this one carried the weight of hope. Harrington taxied onto the runway, accelerating, feeling the aircraft shudder under its own imperfections. He lifted off, the plane responding with surprising stability despite its patched-up frame. Minutes later, the Reaper appeared, its sleek silhouette cutting across the horizon with deadly intent. Harrington felt the familiar tension in his chest, a tight knot that had accompanied him on every mission against this weapon. The cannon fired. Bright streaks of tracer rounds tore through the air, aimed with terrifying precision. Harrington braced for impact, but the rounds behaved strangely. They glanced off the aircraft at impossible angles, scattered slightly, and in some cases, passed without causing damage at all. By the time he returned to base, his face was pale, eyes wide with disbelief. The modification had worked in ways no one had anticipated. The patch and mesh, the paint, all of it had disrupted the enemy weapon's targeting, altering the trajectory and impact of their deadly rounds. Harrington could hardly believe that one rookie's improvisation had achieved what engineers with years of experience had failed to do. On the ground, Thomas barely dared to breathe, watching as the pilot emerged from the cockpit, stunned silence hanging in the air. They had survived, against all odds, and the first crack in the Reaper's armor had finally appeared. The hangar buzzed with tension as Thomas Reed was summoned to the officers' quarters. He walked in, hands trembling slightly, expecting the scolding he had long feared. Instead, he was met with a room full of curious and cautious faces. Senior engineers, pilots, and commanding officers leaned forward, their expressions a mix of skepticism and intrigue. One of the senior engineers, a tall man with silver-streaked hair, spoke first. "What exactly did you do, Reed?" His voice was calm but carried the weight of authority, demanding clarity. Thomas swallowed, trying to organize his thoughts. He described every step from cutting the mesh and weaving it through the frame to painting over the patch and securing it with tape and wiring. He explained the observations that had led him to this improvised solution, the strange patterns he had noticed on the damaged aircraft, and the gut feeling that something about the enemy weapon could be disrupted. The engineers leaned closer, examining sketches and photographs of the modification. Slowly, the room fell into an almost reverential silence. One by one, they realized what Thomas had accidentally achieved. The patch and mesh had subtly altered the aircraft's surface, causing the enemy cannon's rounds to deflect, miscalculate, and, in some cases, lose their penetrating power entirely. The rookie's makeshift repair had neutralized the weapon's accuracy without anyone understanding it fully. It was a breakthrough moment, a discovery born not from theory or experience, but from curiosity, observation, and a fearless willingness to try something unconventional. The officers exchanged glances, realizing that this young mechanic, once underestimated and dismissed, had changed the rules of engagement in a single, unexpected stroke. The discovery of Thomas Reed's improvised repair sent shockwaves through the base, but understanding why it worked required a deep dive into physics and engineering. At first glance, the modification seemed almost comical. Mesh, tape, paint, and a few scraps of aluminum. Nothing about it resembled the precision engineering that went into modern aircraft or the deadly sophistication of the Reaper cannon. Yet, the effect was undeniable, and it could not be ignored. The first factor was airflow disruption. The Reaper's rounds traveled at extreme speeds, relying on a predictable trajectory to hit their target. The patch altered the surface of the aircraft in subtle ways, creating microscopic turbulences in the air around the patch section. These disturbances were enough to slightly shift the angle at which shells struck the fuselage, causing them to glance off instead of piercing straight through. It was a minor change, but at the velocity the rounds traveled, even a fraction of a degree could make the difference between destruction and survival. Radar reflection distortion played a role as well. The Reaper's targeting system relied on early radar guidance to maintain accuracy. The mesh and paint added a layer of irregularity to the aircraft's profile.
Radar waves bounced unpredictably across the patch, creating tiny blind spots or false signals that interfered with the cannon's aim. Engineers quickly realized that this accidental radar camouflage disrupted the weapon's lock-on capability, something no one had anticipated when the rookie made his repair. Heat signature interference added another layer of protection. The thick paint and reinforced patch acted as a mild insulator, dispersing heat from the engine and exhaust. The enemy weapon, partially relying on thermal sensors to adjust trajectory in real time, struggled to track the aircraft accurately. The changes were subtle, but in combination with the other effects, they contributed to a measurable increase in survivability. Energy dispersion and hull angling completed the equation. The patch's placement was not uniform, causing incoming rounds to strike at imperfect angles. Instead of concentrating energy in one destructive path, the impact was spread across a wider area. The aircraft absorbed and deflected the force rather than taking it directly, reducing the likelihood of catastrophic damage. What Thomas had unknowingly created was a multi-layered defense mechanism that combined aerodynamics, material science, and thermal effects without any formal calculation or testing. What makes this breakthrough remarkable was that Thomas achieved it entirely by intuition. He did not understand turbulence equations, radar wave interference principles, or energy dispersion principles. He only observed, experimented, and improvised. In doing so, he exposed a vulnerability in the Reaper that no formal engineering team had detected. The result was a solution elegant in its simplicity, yet profound in its effectiveness. By the time the engineers fully analyzed the patch, the implications were clear. One young mechanic's curiosity and willingness to try something unconventional had produced a weapon countermeasure that could save countless lives in the air. The rookie had stumbled upon a principle that combined physics, material science, and battlefield ingenuity, and the enemy's most feared weapon suddenly no longer seemed invincible.
Once the engineers confirmed Thomas Reed's discovery, the atmosphere at the base shifted almost overnight. What had begun as a curious experiment by a young, underestimated mechanic became an urgent mission. Orders were issued immediately. Every aircraft capable of flight would be retrofitted using the rookie's method. There was no time to waste and no room for hesitation. Workstations across the hangar became a hive of activity. Mechanics who had once laughed at Thomas now gathered around his instructions, studying the diagrams and step-by-step notes with focused attention. The mesh had to be cut and molded precisely, the paint applied just right, and the reinforcements attached with careful care to maintain the integrity of the aircraft. Teams coordinated like never before, moving from plane to plane, ensuring that no aircraft left the base without the new protective patch in place. Pilots watched the process with growing optimism. For the first time in months, the dread that had accompanied every sortie began to lift slightly. The Reaper, once a symbol of inevitable destruction, now seemed beatable, or at least less omnipotent. Confidence spread among the crews like wildfire, and even the most skeptical officers admitted that the modification had the potential to change the balance of air engagements. By the end of the first week, nearly the entire fleet had been upgraded. Aircraft that would have once been considered expendable were now equipped with the rookie's patch, ready to face the enemy with a new layer of protection. Thomas moved quietly among the teams, assisting where needed, but also watching with a mix of pride and disbelief. His improvisation had gone from an experiment in a dimly lit hangar to a standard procedure that could save lives across the skies of Europe. The war was far from over, but for the first time, hope felt tangible. One young mechanic had turned a simple idea into a fleet-wide advantage, and the enemy would soon pay the price for underestimating ingenuity. The change was not immediate, but it was undeniable. Within days of deploying Thomas Reed's modification across the fleet, Allied pilots began returning from missions that would have once been considered suicide. Aircraft that had been shredded by the Reaper cannon now survived direct encounters, often barely damaged, sometimes completely unscathed. The morale among air crews soared. For the first time in months, the grim shadow of inevitable destruction seemed to lift slightly. Axis pilots and gunners were bewildered. The Reaper, their pride and the terror of every Allied mission, was suddenly failing in the sky.
Shells that had once cut through wings and fuselages like knives now glanced harmlessly off aircraft, missed by fractions of an inch or veered unpredictably. Confusion spread among enemy ranks. Reports came in from multiple fronts describing the inexplicable survivability of Allied planes. Commanders demanded explanations. Was it sabotage? New Allied armor? Experimental countermeasures? None of their theories could account for the phenomenon. On the Allied side, the difference was staggering. Pilots gained confidence, flying with renewed precision and daring maneuvers. Losses dropped. Missions that had been postponed or considered too dangerous were now attempted with cautious optimism. Engineers and strategists began to take note, realizing that a simple, improvised patch had tipped the scales of aerial combat, creating a tangible advantage in a war defined by precision and technology. Yet the secret remained hidden from the enemy. They could not comprehend that it was the work of a single young mechanic, a rookie who had trusted his instincts and refused to be dismissed. Thomas Reed's crazy fix, as it had been called with laughter and disbelief, had turned the Reaper from an unstoppable weapon into something flawed, something beatable. The war in the air front had shifted, subtly but decisively, all because of a single act of ingenuity and courage, proving that sometimes the smallest, most unexpected contributions can change the course of history.
The hangar was filled with the low hum of anticipation as Thomas Reed was called forward. Officers, engineers, and fellow mechanics lined the space, their eyes fixed on the young man who had once been overlooked and underestimated. The commanding officer stepped forward, a medal in hand, and spoke clearly so every ear could hear. He praised Thomas for his courage, ingenuity, and the decisive impact of his improvised modification. The medal was placed around his neck, gleaming under the hangar lights, a tangible symbol of achievement. Yet Thomas barely noticed the medal itself. What mattered most was the subtle shift in the eyes of those around him. Mechanics who had once mocked him now nodded with respect, offering quiet congratulations or small, impressed smiles. Pilots clapped him on the shoulder, their gratitude genuine and unreserved. In that moment, Thomas realized he had earned more than recognition from the chain of command. He had earned the trust and admiration of the people who lived and worked alongside him. Despite his youth, Thomas became an unofficial expert on the patch and its applications. He answered questions, gave demonstrations, and guided other mechanics in replicating his method across the fleet. The war would continue, and danger would remain ever present. But Thomas Reed had proven that even the smallest voice, the simplest idea, and the quietest determination could leave a mark that would echo far beyond a single hangar. History often remembers the grand battles, the celebrated generals, and the meticulously planned operations, but it rarely pauses to acknowledge the small acts of ingenuity that quietly shaped the outcome of wars. Countless wartime innovations were born not from strategy manuals or formal research, but from mistakes, improvisations, and the desperate creativity of individuals working under impossible pressure. Pilots improvised new maneuvers in midair. Engineers patched aircraft with whatever materials were at hand. Soldiers modified weapons to solve problems that no one had anticipated. In many cases, these minor acts had consequences that rippled far beyond the moment they occurred. Thomas Reed's contribution is a perfect example of this overlooked truth. His improvised patch, born from observation, intuition, and a refusal to accept limitations, altered the balance of air combat against the Reaper. Yet, like so many other small victories, it was rarely documented in official records. Reports focused on entire squadrons, on aerial victories, on strategies and losses, leaving the role of a young mechanic largely invisible. To most historians, it was as if it never happened. And yet, the impact was real. One small idea, one act of courage and curiosity gave countless pilots a better chance to survive, reshaping engagements in ways that no manual or plan could achieve. It is a reminder that history is not only made by generals and weapons, but also by the quiet, creative minds who refuse to accept impossibility. Sometimes the smallest, craziest ideas, the ones that seem ridiculous at first, are the ones that change the course of events forever. As we close this story, it's worth pausing to remember that history is filled with heroes whose names never make the headlines. Thomas Reed was one of them, a young mechanic barely 20, whose curiosity and courage quietly changed the course of battles. His story reminds us that innovation does not always come from generals, grand plans, or the latest technology. Sometimes it comes from the most unlikely places, from a pair of hands willing to experiment, a mind willing to observe, and a heart willing to take a risk. The Reaper may have been feared across the skies, but it was a single, improvised idea that revealed its weakness. Thomas's contribution was small in the grand scope of the war, yet its impact was profound, saving lives and giving hope to countless pilots. It is a testament to the unsung heroes who worked behind the scenes, the men and women whose brilliance and bravery often went unnoticed, but whose efforts shaped the course of history in ways few ever recorded. If you are fascinated by untold stories of World War II, moments where ingenuity overcame fear, or hidden engineering marvels that altered the battlefield, make sure you join us for the next video. We'll explore another incredible story from the war, one filled with innovation, courage, and surprises that history almost forgot. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to like this video, leave a comment sharing your thoughts, and subscribe to the channel for more hidden mysteries, secret weapons, and the incredible acts of unsung heroes from World War II. Every story we uncover reminds us that sometimes the smallest, most unlikely actions can have the largest consequences.